What's happening, everyone? Steve here, Cars with Steve, and I am so excited right now. Thank you so much for all the support in helping this channel grow. In the last 8 months, we were able to get to that 1,000 subscriber mark, which means I also have to give away a free set of WeatherTech floor liners. Now, those liners are going to end up going to subscriber Andy G. Thank you so much for the support that you've given to this channel so far. In order to figure out how to claim them, take a look in the description below. But I kind of want to do some neat things going forward with the channel. Like maybe when I get to 5,000 or 10,000 subscribers, I'm giving away a couple crazy things, like maybe a car driving experience to drive like a Porsche, maybe a Nissan GTR. Or you know what, when I get to 1 million subscribers, maybe I give away a free car. That'd actually be kind of cool. Alright guys, I'm really excited about all the support you've given this channel, and as always, if you find value in the videos that I'm putting out, make sure you subscribe with the bell notifications on, and please drop down in the comments below with any ideas or suggestions you might have for future videos. Now, this channel is dedicated to talking about cars and their features and benefits, but what happens when something goes wrong? Maybe it's in the manufacturing process or something that consumers find after the fact. The idea behind this series is to figure out what are some of the worst vehicles in our history. And starting off, we're going to be taking a look at the 10 of the worst vehicles of the 1960s. Let's get right into it and have a little bit of fun. The 1962 Rambler Cross Country. Now, at first glance, this car almost looks like the one that was used in Ghostbusters, but it's not. The car that was used in that movie was the 1959 Cadillac Mirlimetero Futura Duplex. Rambler, introduced by auto manufacturer American Motors, they pitched the car initially as a smart and economical means of transportation. Rambler station wagons entered the Rambler lineup in 1951, and while the four-door body style was introduced in 1954, the wagon itself was actually introduced as a cost-saving measure by engineers during the production process. Now, the company did end up enjoying success selling these vehicles in early production years. However, while being billed as a family-friendly vehicle, it lacked a lot of basic safety features. Now, it was discontinued a few years later, however, it still is a car that's sought after by car restoration experts. 1964 Lightburn Zeta Sports. Now this one kind of has a little bit of an interesting look to it, but the Zeta was manufactured in Australia from 1963 to 1965 by the manufacturing company Lightburn & Co. The vehicle itself was designed by Gordon Betson and Keith Peckmore. Now, one of the interesting things about this thing was that the chassis was designed in steel and it had a fiberglass body. Now, on top of that, the body design is a little bit awkward, but one thing is that it's actually missing a tailgate. Now, the Villiers engineering gearbox also had no reverse gear. That means that if you wanted the vehicle to go in reverse, you'd literally have to turn it on, start the engine backwards, and then you'd have 4 reverse gears. Not overly consumer friendly. Now, one other drawback was that this thing also had a fuel gauge that was simply just a plastic pipe. Whether or not it showed your tank as empty or full all depended on what grade you were sitting at. So, if you were parked on or stopped on an angle, your vehicle might show an empty tank. Whereas if you started driving on flat ground, it might show full. Downgrade, you might be a little bit more than full. So it's not really ideal for the consumer. The product was unfortunately a complete failure at launch, selling only 363 units during its production run. An unfortunate swing and a miss. The 1962 BMW Isetta. This vehicle was spearheaded by Italian engineer Renzo Revolta, whose company Iso Revolta SPA was manufacturing scooters and motorcycles. In 1951, Revolta commissioned 2 young engineers, Pierluigi Raggi and Ermenegildo Pareti, to design a tiny automobile powered by a motorcycle engine. The Isetta, meaning Little Iso, was born, and it was powered by a 236cc, 2-cylinder, 2-stroke engine. BMW was struggling in 1954, and they decided to license the Isetta, with production first starting in 1955. Now, the company tried to market the vehicle in North America, and it faced unbelievably lackluster sales. On top of being a little bit too small for the North American market, it was also plagued with issues, including issues with its engine, gearbox, chassis, and more. The final nail in the coffin for this microcar was the introduction of the Volkswagen Beetle and the BMW 700. The 1960 Chevy Corvair. The Corvair was introduced by Chevrolet in 1960, and it's the only American-designed, mass-produced vehicle that also had a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine. Now, the vehicle had a number of different designs over the years, including a 4-door sedan, 4-door station wagon, convertible, a 2-door coupe, a passenger wagon, a commercial van, and a pickup truck. Kinda crazy. The term corvair itself was actually a blend of a few different words, one of them being corvette and the last one being air, which came from the rear-mounted air-cooled engine. Now, Chevrolet ended up deviating from typical American manufacturing in order to create the early models of the Corvair, which were the 569 and the 769 sedans. While the car sold well, it was plagued with issues, including issues tied to its rear engine and the swing axle design. Now, the swing axle actually ended up causing the tires to lose traction with the road, which ended up leading to oversteer. There were hundreds of lawsuits pending against the company, and it was called the leading candidate for the unsafest vehicle on the road by consumer protection activist Ralph Nader. In its final production year, sales of the vehicle had fallen from over 300,000 units during its glory days to less than 6,000 in its final production year. 1962 Ford Anglia. The Ford Anglia was a small family vehicle that was available in the European market. Now, the Anglia name was actually used for a number of different body stylings throughout the years, but the car that we're looking at is specifically the Anglia 105e, which was introduced in 1959. Now, the car itself was actually a Hail Mary for Ford, leading to over 1 million units being sold. When the vehicle was first launched, the Anglia was powered by a 997cc Kent engine that pushed out 50 horsepower and 69 foot-pounds of torque, and it could get from 0 to 60 in a whopping 21.6 seconds. While it was a great seller for Ford, it did have a number of known issues, including rusting throughout the body, knocking from the engine, transmission problems, and steering issues. The car had mostly been forgotten about until Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, where the car, which was owned by Ron Weasley's dad, drives Ron and Harry to Hogwarts. It's the same vehicle that saves them later in the Forbidden Forest. So, while the car is no longer being produced, it's now immortalized thanks to Harry Potter. Appreciate that, J.K. Rowling. The 1963 Hillman Imp. The Hillman Imp was manufactured by Roots Group and its successor Chrysler Europe. Now, it was the first British mass-produced vehicle that had its engine block and cylinder heads cast in aluminum. The car was designed by Formula One driver Michael Parks and engineer Tim Fry. The car itself was actually considered ahead of its time because it incorporated a lot of features that weren't seen in most vehicles until the 1970s. Some of those things included gauges for oil pressure, temperature, and voltage, as well as an automatic choke. The Imp was doomed from the beginning as first reviews of the vehicle came back extremely negative. Consumers were having issues with the engine, which led to a negative view right from the get-go. Some of the other issues including cooling problems and issues with handling that led to an unpredictable ride. While the car still sold well because of its competitive price and its cheap running costs, it was overshadowed by more popular competitors such as the Mini. The 1968 Volkswagen 411. The Volkswagen 411, also known as the Volkswagen Type 4, was manufactured by Volkswagen of Germany from 1968 to 1974. It was available in a 2-door and a 4-door sedan. Now, during its production run, Volkswagen was actually able to manufacture over 350,000 of the Type 4s. When the vehicle was being marketed for launch, it actually received fairly positive reviews from press and consumers alike. However, that tune once changed once the vehicle was actually ready and available for purchase and for test drives. It turns out that the vehicle had serious clutch problems. Customers complained about the engine noise, limited engine output, and a perceived ugly front end. Volkswagen attempted to give all sorts of sales incentives in order to draw people in to buy the vehicle. However, they failed to win over prospective customers because of all of the negative press that the vehicle received. Now, while the 411 didn't have overly impressive sales numbers, there is a little bit of a silver lining for Volkswagen, because the Volkswagen Type 4 was the platform that ended up being the launch of the uber-successful Volkswagen Passat. The 1968 Subaru 360. Subaru's first attempt at bringing a vehicle to the North American market almost ended in disaster for the automaker. The vehicle that we're talking about in question is the Subaru 360, which was introduced to the market by Malcolm Bricklin. Now, the car technically wasn't even classified as a car at all, and the reason why is because US regulators classified a car as a vehicle that weighed more than 1,000 pounds, and the 360 weighed in at just 965 pounds, which means that it wasn't technically subject to the same US safety regulations as larger vehicles. Now, the car was powered by a tiny 25 horsepower motor that went from 0 to 50 miles per hour in 37.5 seconds. Oh, could only imagine. Now, the engine was so lackluster that it could barely achieve 60 miles per hour on flat ground. Consumer Reports blasted the vehicle as calling it not acceptable, which totally makes sense. Sales collapsed as the vehicle also fared very terribly in crash tests, with the bumper of larger American vehicles ending up in the passenger compartment of the 360. Many of the 360s sat on dealership lots for years without ever being purchased. The 1966 Peel Trident. Meet George Jetson is literally the only thing I can think of when I see this car. It looks exactly like the Jetson Mobile. But it was manufactured by the Peel Manufacturing Company in the Isle of Man, and it is a three-wheeled microcar. Now, the vehicle itself was only manufactured from 1965 to 1966, so that should give you an idea of where this is going. Now, the vehicle itself was an oddball vehicle, coming in two different configurations, either with a driver and passenger seat or a driver's seat, and get this, a detachable shopping cart. The vehicle itself was actually marketed as a shopping car? Kind of an interesting thing. Now, the vehicle only had a curb weight of 330 pounds and a top speed of 45 kilometers an hour or 28 miles per hour. But on the flip side, it got an astounding 100 miles per gallon, which for us Canadians is 2.8 liters per 100. The car itself had terrible sales, with customers complaining about the moped motor located underneath the vehicle producing more noise than power. Now, you literally also had to pick up that entire bubble in order to get underneath it, and you literally got to bake yourself under the plexiglass top during hot days. Now, there's a reason why this car was only manufactured for 2 years, and it sits on the list of many consumer sites as being one of the worst cars ever made. The 1961 Amphicar. Now, this is one that's actually kind of an interesting concept, just not the greatest execution. Now, the Amphicar was an amphibious vehicle. It was introduced at the 1961 New York Auto Show. While production stopped in 1965, the vehicle was actually marketed from 1961 to 1968. And it was manufactured by the Quant Group, with a total of 3,878 units being produced during its entire production run. Now, the vehicle was powered by a 1,147cc engine, with claims that it could travel up to 72 kilometers per hour on land and only 7 knots in the water. Kind of underwhelming. Now, while it was also reasonably agile on land, it had terrible maneuverability issues on the water because it was steered using its front tires. Not overly ideal for a watercraft. Now, one of the greatest drawbacks of the vehicle was that it also wasn't overly watertight. Whether or not it would float would also depend on whether or not the bilge pump could keep up with the water that would seep into the vehicle. On top of that, now this is a consumer issue. Most consumers didn't follow company recommendations on routine maintenance for marine use. So that meant that the vehicles ended up corroding and they unfortunately just ended up falling apart. So that one is on the consumer, not necessarily on the manufacturer. While the Amphicar was an interesting idea, it unfortunately was ultimately described as a novelty and never really ended up achieving the sales success that the company had hoped. Well, everyone, that was a look at 10 of the worst vehicles of the 1960s. What was your favorite? Your favorite of the worst? Drop it down below. And please consider sharing the video with your network as well. If you enjoyed the content, please give the video a like and consider subscribing. If you have an idea for a vehicle that you'd like to see in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or the 2000s, let me know down in the comments and I'll give you a thank you in the upcoming video. But until I see you guys next time, make sure you stay safe.